Buenos dias, bon dia, good morning everyone, and thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see all these faces. I have to say that at 8 o'clock this morning, I wasn't certain we'd see anyone but ourselves here. So thank you. My name is Mary Ann Mahoney, and I am the director of the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center here at Central Connecticut State University. So welcome to you and also to our participants online. Today's conference, our second in the Living in Las Americas series, the first was 2 years ago, I think, aims to highlight research done both at CCSU and beyond, and highlight topics of significance to our community, our state, our nation, and our hemisphere. Today we'll learn about COVID-19 and responses to it in rural Peru, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Central America, here in Connecticut, and elsewhere. But we'll also consider topics in a broad variety of other contexts that impact our communities, including social services, healthcare for veterans, historical examples, and others. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a few minutes to thank our sponsors and all the people who have made this possible. First, thank you to Connecticut Humanities for our grant. Without them, culture and intellectual activity in the state of Connecticut would be much less vibrant, and we are grateful to them for our funding. In particular here at CCSU, without their support during all of the things that we have done for Hispanic Heritage Month would have been impossible. Thank you. Thanks also go to the organizing committee, Dr. Sylvia Halil Gutierrez, Dr. Catherine Sugg, and Dr. Reynaldo Rojas. You'll see my name in the list of committee members. Yes, clap for them, please. You'll see my name in the list of committee members, but they kept the event moving by meeting weekly throughout the spring and summer, when we didn't even know if we could do anything on campus or how or where. So I'm extremely grateful to them for this. Thanks also go to Millie Guzman Young. Where are you, Mel? Oh, there she is. And our student workers, Maddie Rodriguez, who's out at the front table right now, Ariana Dizdael, Rena Liz Oquendo, Anthony Lopez, Isabelle de Souza, Andrew Peñaranda, and Colin Fontenelle. They're an extraordinary group of students and responsible for much of what you see today, but especially for insisting that we get into the 21st century and put QR codes on all of our posters. When we started this, I wasn't even sure how QR codes actually work. But anyway, finally, I want to thank the various divisions of the various departments of the Facilities Division, including especially Laura Whittemore and Nick Streifel of Central Reservations and their interns, Spencer Racio of the Media Center, who seems to have disappeared, and others. You all were amazing, helping us to plan 3 events that are on the ground and online all at once. It would have been a challenge in the best of times, but scheduled at the beginning of the semester, in which all of a sudden we had to pivot once again to social distancing because of the Delta variant, made it even more of a challenge, and we are going to be forever grateful. Anyway, let me now introduce CCSU President Zolomotoro, who will share with us some words of welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome, even if it's virtually, to Central Connecticut State University. To those of you with us here, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be able to interact with so many of you. Today, you're attending the final Hispanic Heritage Month event hosted by the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center. Let me say, the center is doing an outstanding job. They are doing exactly what I wanted the center to do since my arrival at CCSU over 4 years ago. To Dr. Marianne Mahoney and her team, all the members of the board of directors of the center, my congratulations and my deep, deep appreciation for a job well done. Today's conference addresses very important and timely topics, including health, justice, and health policy in the Americas from the perspective of the humanities and social sciences. We are so pleased to showcase national and regional scholars as well as our own Latino and Latin American studies faculty that made us so proud. I am really, really honored to say that this work of yours has been recognized by the Connecticut Humanities. That grant that the center received is a testament to that recognition. CCSU is primarily a teaching institution. However, that doesn't mean that we don't engage in scholarship and research of critical importance for our state and the communities we serve. And today, you will see a lot of that. And because we engage in research, we can and we do encourage our students' interest in research and their involvement in the work we do, which is extremely important because that allows our graduates to have experience in research endeavors at the time they complete a degree with us. We are looking forward to a very exciting day of presentations that illustrate how faculty research in the humanities and social sciences can make a contribution to solve the most pressing problems often considered by medical or political in nature. And we can do it in a national, international, and regional context. So today, we demonstrate to the public and our supporters why the social sciences and the liberal arts are so important as part of a comprehensive university. We are demonstrating the value we bring to the table from those disciplines. Before I close, I would like to also thank the organizing committee, Professor Sylvia Galil Gutierrez, Catherine Zog, Reynaldo Rojas, and the center director, as I mentioned, Marianne Mahoney. I also would like to extend my appreciation to the university assistant, Mildred Guzman-Yon, and all the students that were mentioned by Dr. Mahoney earlier. They have done a wonderful work behind the scenes to make all this possible. Events such as these allow us to further our understanding of important issues and to solve problems in communities and across borders. I thank all of you for joining us in celebrating and understanding the contribution of the liberal arts and social sciences to our society. Thank you very much, and I wish you have an enjoyable day.
Hi, I'm Catherine Sugg in the English Department and Latino and Puerto Rican Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel, which today features some of the faculty that are energizing their departments, recently hired in recent years, and we're very excited to hear from Dr. Juan Coronado in History, Dr. Jessica Rutherford from Modern Languages and World Cultures, and Andrew Bentley from Modern Languages and World Cultures. Thank you. They are talking on Latino health, politics, and society in the U.S. and Central America.
Buenos dias, good morning, and welcome. Good to see so many people in person. My talk today will be focusing on the politics of healthcare for Latino Vietnam veterans. When we look at the Latino experience in Vietnam, traditionally it's been somewhat difficult to put a good hold on the Latino experience. First of all, during the Vietnam War era, there was not a classification to classify Latinos that were in the armed services. They were simply, for the most part, categorized as white. For those of you who do not know this, the term Hispanic was first used in the U.S. Census in the 1980 U.S. Census. The military started distinguishing Hispanics in 1975. This is after the end of the Vietnam War. So for folks who do this type of research, we've had to go in there, look at the names, and the best we could come up with is a rough estimate: 180,000 Latinos that we estimated that served. The large majority of these folks served in what we call the infantry as foot soldiers. And when we talk about the effects that warfare had on these folks, because they experienced the war up front, up close and personal, this led to significant consequences, higher casualty rates, and today's talk will be on the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, being in those situations in hand-to-hand combat, being out in the jungle, this led to significant higher PTSD rates, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not something new, but it was categorized after the Vietnam War. Going back to World War II, folks called it shell shock or post-World War syndrome, right? But by the mid-1970s, with a great amount of folks coming back from war, having difficulties, we finally started studying more, and by the 1970s, we figured that it was a condition. And finally, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association recognized PTSD as a condition. Right? For us folks from Latino backgrounds, in doing the research, in talking to some of these veterans, whether they're Puerto Rican, Mexican American, they came back to their communities, and we were having a conversation last night with one of our keynote speakers, and I don't want to butcher this, but in reading the literature, veterans were going back to Puerto Rico, and they were being labeled as loquitos, a little crazy. And of course, we weren't grasping what was really going on with them. In South Texas, we use the term trastornados, that they came back a little disoriented, right? And I think as a community, we were really trying to figure out what they were dealing with, right? And this was post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, it speaks to the gap that Latino community faces in mental health, right? So these folks were coming back, and it was noticeable that they were dealing with a lot, all right? So there were efforts in the Veterans Affairs, the VAs across the country to address the health needs of these individuals, right? In my research, I'm not in the medical field, but as a historian, I began to really investigate what was going on with these veterans. And of course, I spent my time focusing on Mexican-American prisoners of war in Vietnam. And it was very clear to me that they did not want to open up about their experiences. They did not want to talk about their experiences. And part of this is culturally. Part of it is the nature of what they had experienced, dealing with trauma. Latinos, like other young men, were conditioned to hide their emotions. Of course, now today we talk about issues such as toxic masculinity and what these folks were dealing with, right? And a lot of them, I began to identify, did not want to speak to me about their experiences. This individual that you see here in that photograph, to the guy in the middle is me about a decade and a half ago. The guy to the right, his name was Juan Jacques, is Juan Jacques, and he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for close to 7 years. And how I got a hold of him was mere luck. I had written him a letter asking to talk to me, asking for an interview. He never wrote me back. I grew desperate, and I called the Santa Fe Veterans Affairs office to see if they could give me a better contact for him, whether it's a phone number, a better address. The woman who answered the call took my call politely, and I asked her, I'm looking for a Vietnam veteran in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She responded, what is the veteran's name? And I told her, Juan Jacques. Without missing a beat, she said, oh my God, that's my father. What are the odds? Right? She said, I am 35 years old, and he has never once talked to me about his experiences in Vietnam. Never once has he opened up about what he went through in those prison camps. She said, I can't make you any promises, but I am going to talk to my father. I don't think it's coincidence that we met today over the phone, but I'm going to talk to my father and see if he will grant you an interview. It took her 6 months to convince her father to speak to me. And when he opened up, he really opened up, right? Part of my research has been to provide an environment that is conducive for these men to open up, right? I went beyond question, answer, interview, and I developed a style of more of a conversational interview. And this allowed these men to share their experiences with me. And it also helped that I am bilingual. Oral history is not just about doing an interview. It's about setting up an environment that is comfortable and that the interviewee can trust you. And I spoke their language. I jumped from English to Spanish like some of us do. And this always helped in the interviews. By the end of the interview, I had driven 5 hours for this interview on a Friday afternoon. He asked me, hey, what are you doing this weekend? The interview did not stop there. He was so comfortable that he let his guard down, probably for the very first time in his life, and spent the entire weekend talking about his experiences. And here we are looking at, test driving some of, that's a motorcycle behind us that he built. And this allowed him to further open up. All right. When looking at some of the consequences of the Latino experience in Vietnam, their participation led to extremely high casualty rates and death rates. Have some figures here. At a certain point in the war, between January of '61 and February of '67, Spanish surnamed soldiers from the U.S. Southwest accounted for about 19.4% of all troops killed in action in Vietnam. from December of 67 to March of 69. 67 and 69 in Vietnam. This is the peak of the war. This is right in the middle of the Tet Offensive, where the fighting just became much more intense. Spanish surname soldiers from the Southwest accounted for close to 20% of the killed in action. At that time in history, Latinos only made up about 4.5% of the total population in the U.S. So you could see how extremely high these figures were. From my home county in South Texas, in '68, the death rate of Latino soldiers was almost double the national rate. And this is significant because Hidalgo County is one of the most impoverished counties in the country. And significantly, we see a correlate there with military participation, where these folks join the military, due to lack of opportunity, right? At the end of the war in '73, many of these young men came back home to a rude awakening. In 1973, as soon as the United States pulled ground troops and the men that I wrote about in my book, these returning POWs, as soon as they came back, that summer we saw something terrible occur. Within a month of their return, 2 young men took their lives. And this is a photograph of one of the Chicanos that I wrote about in my book, Larry Kavanaugh from Denver, Colorado. Of course, his body being escorted by pallbearers. And the military really wanted answers. What was going on with these young men? Those 2 suicides in the summer of '73 caused the military to take action. And all returning POWs were ordered examinations to see what was going on. The military wanted answers. And unfortunately, a lot of young men fell through the cracks. And a lot of these young folks were not being treated through the healthcare system the way they should have. When we look at the Latino military experience today, we're in a very similar situation. Today, Latinos form 17% of active troops in the service today. With the wars that were ongoing for close to 2 decades, Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of these young men and women came back with similar situations where they came needing health care and things of that nature. I'd like to go a little further here and look at what the Latino experience has done for many of these folks. Going back to the World War I folks, World War II folks, these folks came back and wanting a better place in society. A lot of them went to college after that. After that, a lot of them opened businesses. One thing that we're seeing today, we're seeing a high lack in leadership positions. In the last 25 years, we've only seen 1 Latino become a 3-star general, none going into 4-star. We see an increase in active duty officers, almost triple here. But this speaks to the systemic issues that keeps Latinas, Latinos, Latinx people from moving up the ranks. And this is not just in the military, but in society, right? So with the great number of Latinos in the service, we still need to be a little bit aware of their mental health issues today. Thank you.
on the same PowerPoint.
Same PowerPoint?
Yep,
Oh,
all
so I
one.
guess we'll have to make sure.
I'm sorry, I'm just so used to teaching this that I completely forgot to take it off.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Coronado, for that wonderful presentation. This morning I'm going to be talking about Latinx political cartooning as what I call social artivism, as a way of processing and coping with the global pandemic that we're still in the middle of, unfortunately. Alrighty. As we're all too well aware, in the early months of 2020, a novel coronavirus responsible for the spread of the infectious disease known as COVID-19 shook the world, shutting down global economies in an unprecedented physical lockdown. In its wake, the epidemiological force of COVID-19 laid bare the reality of unjust social systems structured by neoliberal global economics and their impact on marginalized and disenfranchised populations around the world. To highlight the way in which the coronavirus has disproportionately impacted these communities in the U.S., one of the global hotspots for the virus, this presentation turns to the work of Latinx political cartoonists Lalo Alcaraz and Eric J. Garcia, well known for their incisive social critiques, sharing this work on their respective syndicates and on social media platforms. This presentation focuses on how the political cartoons posted help followers to process and cope with COVID-19 concerns via parody and satire, the stylistic linchpins of political cartooning, and in doing so, create an alternative archive that chronicles underrepresented Latinx voices and experiences to confront systemic oppression during a global pandemic. In what follows, I analyze the way in which these author-artists draw through the pandemic on Pocho, Lalo Alcaraz's website, not only to help followers process and cope with COVID-19, but also to advocate for social justice reforms. The voices and experiences that Alcaraz and Garcia represent are inherently transcultural in that they move and exist between cultures, occupying a hybrid space, a physical and social borderland that requires a complex negotiation of multiple cultural frameworks simultaneously. We see this, for example, in Alcaraz's deployment of Spanglish and the hybrid iconographic slant to his work, pulling symbols from Latinx American repertoires as well as U.S. imagery related to nation-building campaigns, deployed in political cartoons from the late 18th century on. Alcaraz describes some of his hybrid cultural experience as a Chicano, as a Mexican-American in California, and as the son of an undocumented mother, in a podcast interview with On Being Project, a nonprofit media site that promotes civil conversations and social healing. With regard to his use of parody and satire in his work, as well as the transcultural symbolic repertoire from which he draws, he explains how laughter has always been a coping mechanism in the face of systemic marginalization, both for himself and his family, and for Mexican-American culture more broadly. He goes on to connect this with his cartoons and comics, and he says, "And I do push Spanglish. I do push biculturalism to make it normal. That's what I didn't see growing up on TV. I grew up on the border in San Diego as a kid. Never saw brown people on TV unless I watched the stuff in Spanish. But so eventually I realized, wow, we are just not anywhere. What's going on?" So the mixing of Spanish and English, i.e. Spanglish, also known as code switching in the field of linguistics, is a consistent thread that Alcaraz weaves to bind his cartoons and comics to his mission to raise awareness related to issues of biculturalism and immigration in the U.S., as is evident in his long-running syndicated comic strip, La Cucaracha. So today, taking a cultural studies approach to unpack the significance of the work of these Latino author-artists, this analysis pulls from the theoretical interventions regarding identity, culture, and memory that Diana Taylor carves out in her work, The Archive and the Repertoire, Performing Cultural Memory in the Americas. As does Taylor, I also engage with Gloria Anzaldua's reflections on the way in which language and power intersect in society, and based on this dynamic, the need to create and share decolonial narratives. Both cultural theorists, as well as the political cartoons of Alcaraz and Garcia, bring attention to the pain and trauma that that go along with the fragmentation or the fracturing of marginalized identities and experiences from the colonial period to the present, positioning the issue of systemic oppression throughout the Americas as rooted in European colonialism. The hybrid transcultural approach that both author-artists offer exemplifies what Ansaldúa describes as the new mestiza consciousness in Borderlands La Frontera and a new tribalism in Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro, focusing on the power of narrative to serve as a radical act of healing that works to process and cope with trauma, oftentimes due to racialized systemic oppression. In her chapter dedicated to the topic, Ansaldúa argues that the fragmentation that takes place in the borderlands also has a creative impetus, and that the new subject that is created there is made stronger via the process of mestizaje. And in the case of the capacity of borderland art to heal colonial pain and trauma on a symbolic level, Ansaldúa finds that, I quote, "The creative process is an agency of transformation." She goes on to assert that using the creative process to heal or restructure the images, stories that shape a person's consciousness is a more effective way of healing. This view of art as transformative is consistent in her reflections on the author-artist as social activist. In the editor's introduction to the posthumous publication of these reflections in Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro, Ana Luis Keating explains that Ansaldúa identifies creativity and storytelling with healing and associates both with progressive socio-political change on multiple levels, defining illness broadly to include the effects of colonialism, assimilation, racism, sexism, capitalism, environmental degradation, and other destructive practices, epistemologies, and states of being that occur at individual, systemic, and planetary levels. Ansaldúa maintains that artists can assist in the healing process, which is what I argue today that Alcaraz and Garcia do. The power of art to heal and the role of the author-artist is key to understanding the way in which the political cartoons of Alcaraz and Garcia help their followers to process and cope with the physical and social dis-ease that follow in the wake of the coronavirus, constructing a complex transcultural framework to represent social injustice in the U.S. and around the globe. To do this work, both author-artists draw from a Mexican-American heritage, primarily in an ideological sense, but also in some aesthetic borrowing that harks back to a long tradition of social critique, such as the work of 19th century Mexican artist José Guadalupe Posada, as well as that of Diego Rivera, who spearheaded the Muralismo movement in the 20th century, not only in Mexico, but also on the international stage. Regarding his connection to Rivera, Garcia, in an interview on Smash Pages, the comic superblog, he outlines the trajectory of his work and the inspirational roots that ground it, which he traces to a Chicano activist newspaper from the University of Highlands in New Mexico, also El Machete. Later, he learned that the New Mexican-American newspaper derives from Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros' own work on El Machete newspaper in early 20th century Mexico. While Garcia's social mission is directly linked to that of El Machete newspaper from early 20th century Mexico, his style is more akin to that of Lalo Alcaraz than the Mexican art that characterized that period, with a few exceptions, like that of the riff that both author-artists make on Posada's earlier work. And we see that here, for example, as Alcaraz borrows from Posada, in a post from July 2nd, 2020, and as you see here, he says, "This July 4, let's not have a carne asada party, okay?" In this cartoon, Alcaraz calls on Posada to provide a public health warning. If you gather in large groups for the upcoming national holiday during the pandemic, you might end up dead. Alcaraz, as is customary in cartooning, includes a note to his predecessor in the cartoon, writing, "With apologies to Posada." Garcia also evokes Posada in his work, regularly incorporating the iconic skeletal figures originally used by Posada to critique the ruling class in Mexico, to make similar critiques against social inequality in his cartoons today. The thread that links the three, beyond the aesthetic borrowing from the latter two that they borrow from the former, is the way in which they use humor, that is parody and satire, to document social injustices, which creates a space in which their followers can process and cope with a long history of physical and social disease in the Americas. As I demonstrate in this presentation, because of the social justice advocacy inherent to these cartoons, they serve as a powerful shaping device, helping followers to process and cope with difficult realities while countering dominator discourse symbolically. We see this in the cross-posting of the author-artist cartoons on Pocho, a significant space for the virtual muralism that these author-artists do in the name of social justice, forging a dialogic connection between the two cartoonists. On February 13, 2020, Alcaraz releases one of his early images commenting on the virus. The panel is simple, in color, and shows an alien in outer space looking down on the Earth. The Earth wears a face mask, dripping sweat beads with sick eyes that show the illness and fear that surfaced as the infectious disease swept through the globe. The U.S., along with Brazil, stands out as one of the global hotspots of the virus, among many more now, unfortunately, that started on the coast, with the East Coast, New York City, and its suburbs being hit particularly hard early on, and then making its way inland in subsequent waves of exponential infection throughout the country. The aliens decide to postpone their visit in Alcaraz's cartoon. In this instance, not overtly political, Alcaraz marks the moment when the novel coronavirus begins to enter collective imaginaries in the U.S. In response to the dramatic impact of COVID-19 across the globe, Alcaraz and Garcia picked up their ink to document these nation-shaking moments, cartooning the impact of the virus as well as the misinformation campaigns operating in and through U.S. politics, spearheaded by the Trump administration in 2020. The timeline and the pace of the unfolding of the impact of COVID-19 on U.S. society is dizzying, and Pocho chronicles the impact of the virus on vulnerable demographics, worsened due to the constant mismanagement of the federal response to the virus. A pair of cartoons, one by Garcia and the other by Alcaraz, posted on Pocho on May 7th, depict the way in which the virus marks the The timeline and pace, okay, so here we are. So a pair of cartoons depict the way in which the virus makes the cannibalism of neoliberal economics and global capitalism, largely driven by U.S. imperial interests, all the more literal as we see the way in which questions of immigration intersect with essential workers. In these cartoons, we see the way in which essential workers, largely immigrant communities, are carved up for elite consumption during the pandemic, literally sacrificing their lives for a low-wage income, feeding the transnational corporations that benefit from these capitalist structures. Garcia in this cartoon depicts this with the figure of death, with COVID-19 written on its back. Hooded cloaks serving marginalized and disenfranchised populations, many of whom are people of color or immigrants, for the consumption of big business, represented as the fat cat with the word capitalism for teeth. The U.S. federal government, personified once again as Uncle Sam, stands complicit, with a speech bubble that says, "I hope the fat cat likes it." Alcaraz's cartoon here takes a simpler approach to the issue, drawing a meatpacking plant worker hanging alongside the pigs that he was in the process of butchering. This is a reference to the way in which COVID-19 spread in these plants, endangering these essential workers. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported that among 23 states reporting COVID-19 outbreaks in meat and poultry processing facilities, 16,233 cases in 239 facilities occurred, including 86 COVID-19 related deaths. Among cases with race ethnicity reported, 87% occurred among racial or ethnic minorities. Commonly implemented interventions included worker screening, source control measures, universal face coverings, engineering controls, physical barriers, and infection prevention measures. On April 28, 2020, Trump issued an executive order requiring that the plants continue to operate, even though they were unable to do so safely under the current guidelines and structures. The political cartoons of Alcaraz and Garcia, shared on Pocho in early May, represent the deadly cruelty behind this policy. In this way, they use parody and satire to document these types of social injustices, a dialogic space in which their followers can process and cope with a long history of physical and social disease in the Americas, even more painful during the pandemic. In this regard, these political cartoons serve as a significant contribution in the larger social justice movement pushing for reforms, both in the form of image-based resistance, social artivism, and in the preservation of alternative archive that challenges dominator discourse. To wrap up the presentation today, we see that both Alcaraz and Garcia use their political cartoons to create a narrative that combines image and text to succinctly speak out against social injustice in its various forms. They distribute their work across syndicates, social media, and on Pocho, creating a dialogical space for virtual muralism, a trans-American tradition. Pocho is a unique archive because of its independence and distinctly Latino perspective, documenting in part the larger cultural memory of Latinx American communities in relation to U.S. political history. The cartoons that we find on Pocho are intensely symbolic, drawing from both a Latinx American repertoire as well as from an established iconography of U.S. political symbolism. It is this hybridity that creates a transcultural space to represent the social critique that these cartoonists offer, not only for the communities that they represent, but also for allies that share their calls for social justice and equality. Moreover, the Latino cartoons that we find on Pocho, made by and for Latinos and those that are interested and or invested in Latino culture, serve as a significant alternative archive that counters white supremacist narratives that dominate U.S. political discourse in this context. The political cartoons that Alcaraz and Garcia create, exemplified via their contribution on Pocho, render visible the voices and experiences of marginalized communities in the face of systemic oppression in the U.S. In doing so, this creates a visually driven narrative that helps these communities and their allies process and cope with this physical and social disease, only worsened by the impact of a raging global pandemic in the U.S. In depicting these experiences, it is made clear that both believe there's a space for intersectional allyship in the fight for equality and justice among marginalized populations within Latinx American communities throughout the hemisphere. During the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, the struggle of Latino communities, asylum seekers from Mexico and Central America, and populations embodied by the Black Lives Matter movement are center stage in the political cartooning of Alcaraz and Garcia. These cartoons are powerful, cross-cultural representations that identify the symptoms of the physical and social disease that afflicts marginalized populations, bringing attention to the pain and trauma that go along with the fragmenting or fracturing of Latinx American identity and culture from the colonial period to the present. And in the interest of healing, they use, as Ansaldúa advocates, the creative process to heal or restructure the images, stories that shape a person's consciousness as a more effective way of healing. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. I am so pleased to be here this morning in person. I see a lot of my students here, including ones that don't normally have class at this time, so that just makes me so thrilled to be here, and it's an honor to present alongside my colleagues, Dr. Juan Coronado and Dr. Jessica Rutherford. I especially see a lot of parallels here in terms of themes of war and public health, and even Latin American and Latinx identities in public health in general, and now visual ways of representation. So I would just like to start with a few questions, actually. The first is, how many people here, just by a show of hands, are active on some social media platform, at least one? And of those people, how many of you are actively using Facebook? What about Twitter? Instagram? Snapchat? The demographics always shift with these last two ones. And then what about TikTok? Once again, the demographics shift. We're more, maybe, the divide is very interesting to see. But nevertheless, I'm sure as social media users, we can all reflect on how these platforms have evolved over the years. I started using Facebook and around when it was really getting popular, about 2007, and I really remember it as being just a space of entertainment and consumption, and it was goofy, and it was just a way to be in touch with people. I remember when Twitter started to gain traction in 2009-ish, and people would say, oh, that has a weird name, and that's never going to be popular, and now look where we are. And then certainly Instagram a little bit later, and Snapchat around 2012, and we've seen how these platforms, I'm sure, have evolved, have, especially around election times, have transformed into political platforms as a way to disseminate information and share articles and talk about our contemporary moment. And so in my presentation, I'm thinking about the hashtag Caravana de Migrantes, which specifically centers on the caravans of migrants from Central America and how these migration flows have continued to gain momentum and transform in times of COVID-19. So in this first slide, and this image comes to us by courtesy of National Geographic, or excuse me, this one is from the Center for Immigration Studies. We see a map originating in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, toward the bottom portion of the screen there. And the date is October 13th, 2018. It was just a little bit before Thanksgiving that year that an absolutely massive caravan of asylum seekers from Honduras joining forces with people from also El Salvador and Guatemala began the arduous journey to the United States. And by about November 15th, the first people in those caravans started to finally reach Tijuana and San Diego, California. So we can think about that as roughly a month-long journey. You may remember this specific moment, or certainly other moments where we've seen repeatedly this notion of caravans, a large amount of people seeking asylum from, and the media often refers to it as the Northern Triangle of Central America. That is to say, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. In particular, Guatemala and El Salvador share that they're both in the aftermath of really long internal armed conflicts and civil wars. El Salvador's from 1980 to 1992, Guatemala from 1960 until 1996, so almost 40 years in that case. Honduras, in the aftermath of the U.S.-sponsored 2009 coup that overturned democracy in that country. And then certainly all of these countries have begun to see the aftermath in terms of poverty, violence, inequalities, especially for women, Afro-descendant populations, indigenous populations, and LGBTQ plus people. And then we've also seen, of course, especially in recent years and especially since 2020, the evolution of climate refugees. I should note that we see here beyond San Pedro Sula, just to the south of Mexico, all the countries of Central America represented in this map, which are among the most vulnerable to climate change due to their geographic location, particularly with their Caribbean coasts. And of course, now COVID-19 and seeking COVID security, which there is none to speak of, especially in the remotest parts of these countries, has emerged as another factor for people to seek asylum. But before we quite get to that part, I want to go back to what I was saying just a moment ago about the caravan in October 2018. And I should say that these images that I'll show from social media are quite powerful, are quite strong. They circulated very quickly and certainly generated a large popular response. And in this particular image, we see a Mexican police helicopter hovering over the Suchiate River. The Suchiate River divides Guatemala with the Mexican state of Chiapas. So you'd have to note that this group of people, being Honduran migrants, had already crossed the entirety of Guatemala, which is roughly the size of the state of Tennessee. So already quite a significant portion of their journey had been completed at that point, and they reached the Suchiate River. And we see the police helicopter hovering down over the migrants in an overt attempt to drown them, in an overt attempt to prevent them from crossing from Guatemala into Mexico. And there is a documentation of at least one man who died out of exhaustion. The water actually wasn't too shallow, but underneath just the force of the helicopter was unable to match that force, and it ended up collapsing in the water and dying. And this is just one example of many, scenarios of violence acted upon people crossing borders. And we begin to really reconsider a few things here. Number one, the border, because I think many of us would agree that popular media considers the border as being the U.S.-Mexico border, as if that's the only one in existence in the world, number one, and as if that's the only one that migrants need to cross. But in this case, the Honduran migrants were crossing several borders, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, before reaching Mexico. So number one, one that makes us contemplate that. And number two, we can also think beyond the border crisis and thinking about borders in and of themselves as the crises, as that violent space, because that Honduran gentleman who passed away was effectively stateless because the river is the border. He wasn't really anywhere when he died. And so that really gets at the heart of shifting identities in these migration flows. This image came from the Latin American Studies Association Facebook page, which is one of the largest or the largest professional organization for the study of Latin America, and they specifically have different sections on different regions, and this one came from the Central America section, October 30th, 2018. These next few images I'm showing are much more recent from Instagram. And this image here comes from the Instagram page of Esteban Biba, and I've included his handle there if people want to take a look at his work that he puts out. Biba is a Guatemalan photojournalist who is on the ground in Guatemala and on the so-called migrant trail. And so he posts very, very, very contemporary images. These ones were posted he posts them the same day that he takes the picture, always, actually. So these ones came on January 18th, 2021. Very interesting to take note of that date because it's a few days before the Biden inauguration, right? And so the timing is not coincidental. In this case, we see on the left-hand side, Guatemalan police this time, and on the right-hand side, we see Honduran migrants who are attempting to cross into Guatemala in another caravan en route to the United States. It's significant that some of the migrants, if you look very carefully, some of them wear face masks, some of them do not. And the reason for the clash, in this case, between the police and the migrants is that none of them could provide proof of not even a vaccination, but could not even provide a negative COVID test. They didn't have the resources for that. And so we see how effectively that lack of being able to provide a negative COVID test was weaponized against these people who were physically prevented from crossing into Guatemala. Most significant is the child in the middle of the photo. And that may evoke images, and I actually should have included it, but it may help us recall images of the Honduran girl from a few summers ago who appeared on the cover of Time, who was separated from her mother. Is the same ghostly almost image of an absolute child, no more than, I'm not sure, maybe about 3 or 4 years old, probably not even, in the middle of this photo. And the child seems to act as a divide between the police and the migrants. And at the same time, if we look at the caption, which is in Spanish, we see the hashtag Caravana de Migrantes. It divides the written portion of the post, just as the child divides either side of the equation at the Guatemala-Honduras border. So you can really, in this post, think about Instagram as an opportunity to feel, as an opportunity to be sympathetic with migrants, as an opportunity to understand exactly as much as we can from a very comfortable distance what they experience on their perilous journeys. And this next image is also from Esteban Biba, and it is the Guatemalan military this time very violently striking Honduran migrants who tried to break through the barrier to enter Guatemala, again, because they could not provide a negative COVID test. So we see really where that weaponization of that is really in full force. And we can see the geotagged location is Chiquimula, which is the Guatemalan departamento, which is the department, kind of like a state that is right there on the border. And we can really take into account what's going on here with these hashtags, again, Caravana de Migrante, Guatemala, Honduras, photoperiodismo, photojournalism. The hashtags do more than just help us think about the content. Along with the geotagging, they enable the photo to reach a broader audience. And so we can think about how hashtags, I think a lot of times we don't even use anymore on Instagram. It was all the rage when it first came out in 2012, but it's kind of gone out of style, and maybe you date yourself a little bit if you use them. But in this case, I'm talking about myself, by the way, because I still use hashtags. were really started as a fun and whimsical way of engaging with social media, can also be a way for us to get at the heart geographically, culturally, ethnically, politically, with migration. So even just the hashtags alone can be a subject of study. Here's another image from also, these all three are from Esteban Biba. I find very powerful indeed. So these people, these Honduran people, were actually able to cross into Guatemala, and you see these families who are crossing with their children in strollers, and the child in the stroller seems to look up inquisitively at the police officers, and totally unaware, certainly, of the absolute brutality of what just occurred at the border, but still probably old enough to have some faint memories of what has happened, with the light from the street light just naturally casting directly onto the child. So once again, the child is the focal point of this image, and allows us to consider just how precarious the journey is, and how how a child, a very young child may envision this journey. This next photo actually moves a little bit beyond the immediate context of Central America, although still relevant to this conversation, and it's one that actually surfaced just a few weeks ago. Again, these images are very powerful. This one is no exception. This image is from John B. Moore, who is another photojournalist. He works in the area of South Texas and northern Mexico, documenting migration. His handle is JB Moore Photo on Instagram. If you'd like to check out a little bit more of his absolutely outstanding photojournalism work. And on September 20th, 2021, very recently indeed, he captured this astonishing image of a Haitian father and his baby, one among many thousands and thousands and thousands of Haitian asylum seekers who are crossing from Ciudad Acuña in the north of Mexico, in the Rio Grande, toward the area of Del Rio, Texas. And these people, if you were noticing in the news very recently, had reached Del Rio, Texas, and set up I hesitate to use the word, but for lack of a better term, a camp of sorts underneath the International Bridge in Del Rio, Texas, in an attempt to seek asylum in the United States. So the Central Americans from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are fleeing post-conflict violence, also seeking COVID security. The Haitians, in these cases, actually did not, in large part, originate in Haiti. They had been displaced in 2010 after the major earthquake absolutely devastated the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, and its outskirts, leaving almost or over 300,000 people dead and even more homeless. And so these people had been displaced in Panama, in Colombia, in Chile, in Brazil. And so to think about the absolute enormity of their trip that they had to take by land from those countries through the entirety of all the Central American countries, through the entirety of Mexico to reach this point, speaks volumes to the multi-layered marginality that we see at the border. And in this case, many of the Haitian migrants were actually making their way back into Mexico, having been effectively forced out. And I'm certain a number of you in this room saw those very brutal images, and there are parallels between what happened in Del Rio, Texas with the Haitian migrants and the Honduran migrants in Guatemala clashing with police. So Instagram really in this case helps us to be critical of our contemporary moment, to help us understand our own place on social media as very distant observers, comfortably far away from these scenarios, but nevertheless able to engage critically with migration as a focal point of Latin American and Latinx identities in the United States, which is going on now throughout Heritage Month and the other day with Indigenous Peoples Day, and we continue those conversations. So thank you so very much. lot of it, that's an excellent question. A lot of it has to do with their own lack of resources. Actually, the largest import of Moderna vaccines did not reach Guatemala until July. So a lot of it had to do with just the different timelines. That's a really important thing for us to contemplate. It can be very easy to get caught up in our own, as one student brilliantly called it, pseudo-recovered semester that we're experiencing right now and our own immediate experiences with the virus. However, Latin America and the Caribbean, unfortunately, are quite behind in terms of having the resources to provide COVID security. So more than anything, it was a lack of resources in part. But also, I believe, unfortunately, that even if the resources had been there, that there still would be that weaponization of the lack of vaccination or lack of negative tests, just in terms of the different manifestations of racism that occur within the region, which I kind of touched upon, certainly is something for us to consider. And it makes us uncomfortable, of course, but it's important for us to understand the big picture of what migration looks like. So thank you so much for that question.
I have a question. I was reading recently, or hearing John Oliver kind of spoke about misinformation, really. And it flipped me, because I'm thinking of misinformation here in English. And you know, what we're dying, Facebook is doing whatever little, but it's trying to do something, and maybe, but then I kind of opened my eyes to like, yeah, but they're not doing anything about misinformation, Spanish misinformation, and they're recognizing that some people, that's how they get their news nowadays. They don't have TV even, and so they get their news through Facebook or through Instagram. And so this made me realize how these folks are making efforts to really portray the reality of the situations versus others, you know, who use social media to misinform. So I don't know, you know, as you work in that kind of research exploring those images, brings that idea of trying to, I mean, I don't know if you want to comment on that, and how can this social media hopefully are used to spread this reality instead of all the misinformation that is going on. So.
Absolutely, you know, that's really, and I was talking about it with my students, there was certainly the outage last Monday of Facebook and the other Facebook-owned social media platforms of Instagram and WhatsApp. If you're not familiar with WhatsApp, it's a messaging service that you can use without data. WhatsApp is the lifeline of communication in Latin America and the Caribbean and other parts of the global south, Africa and Asia certainly. And so the shutdown or the outage for about 6 hours on that day was inconvenient for us at most, but it was absolutely catastrophic for Latin Americans. So effectively, and they use Instagram direct messaging and certainly Facebook Messenger to similar capacities. That is their primary mode of communication. And certainly it's their primary mode of the news, of reading the news. And we think about how much it used to be that we had to go looking for the news, and now with social media, even on Snapchat and TikTok, the news just comes to you. It's just there. And so you can't help but be aware of what's going on. Even if it's not necessarily a page that you follow, the information is just there. And so certainly, and I didn't get into the aspect of the comments. I talked a little bit about the hashtags, but the comments also, because this is a public forum, do invite people from around the world to reflect. And some of the ones about Esteban Viva's work in Guatemala, we're talking about the human condition, we're talking about being empathetic, we're from Latinx people in the United States who were learning more about their countries of origin through the posts. And then the hashtags lead to other posts, and the geotags lead to other posts, and then they can really understand Instagram in that case as an archive that they can actually participate in. So that's a really, really interesting comment.
But WhatsApp could be very dangerous because
Yes.
it's a messaging service, so
Yes.
people distribute
Yes.
all kinds of misinformation through that app, right? And you get this information, and I have to verify when I get stuff from something like that. I'm like, dude, this is not true. Like, look this up. This is not true. Like, you can't be sending this stuff to people, right? Because people take it literally, right? So yeah, it's a good point. It can be very, very dangerous. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.